everybody, and welcome to another tier list. This time we're going to be taking a look at all the tanks and how they're doing in a raid. Kind of start off with just throwing it out there that we had our goal of 1,000 subscribers by January. We're getting really close to that, so if you're able to help us out and subscribe, it really helps the channel a lot, but won't bemoan that too much. So kind of to start with on the tanks, we mentioned in the last video, but tank tuning right now is just incredibly close. These tanks, we're going to nitpick and kind of try to separate them out a little bit, but these tanks really are incredibly close to each other in their power levels that they bring, with one kind of exception here. All of these tanks are close enough that if you have the opportunity to bring a raid buff that your raid is otherwise missing, that will pretty much always be more useful than the difference between any of these tanks. So if your raid doesn't have a Druid and you're able to bring Mark of the Wild, that will be more useful than the difference between any of the tanks in the list. Like, the amount of use you get there is big. So we'll talk about what those buffs are, but just keep that in mind that if you do have that buff and you're just looking to help the raid out as much as you can, that's probably going to be the way to do it. So we'll get started then. I think we're going to start with the leather tank. So let's talk about Brewmaster Monk first.
All right, Brewmaster is going to fall solidly in A tier. For Mythic Plus, we had this towards the bottom of the list. Actually, they ranked the worst tank. A lot of that because of its survivability and just in those situations where you're taking small physical damage, hits, and along with lots of kind of sustained magic damage, it falls off. In Raid, there's a lot less of that. Most of it's kind of big physical hits, and it really handles that well with Stagger, as well as just kind of having a button for every situation. Celestial Brew being on a pretty low cooldown, you're going to get big shielding from that. If you're using your Fort Brew, Dampen Harm, even if spots where you can find Diffuse Magic for when you are taking magic damage, it kind of has a button for everything. Monk also has really good mobility, which is nice to have in Raid. It also brings all that great utility with stops and stuns, which is helpful in some of the fights because there are quite a few fights where you're going to get like a wave of ads, see Diurna, Dathia, things like that, where also its AoE damage is really going to shine. There's a 4-target cleave fight. It's just 4 target for the Primal Councils, 4 targets up all the time. Monk's going to do really well during that fight, as well as the mobility helps too. With that one, because you are going to have to kind of duck into some fire and then get back to the boss. There's a lot of movement on that fight as well. One thing also that Brewmaster does well is if you are going to be in high stagger situations, which happens more in Raid than in Mythic Plus, talents like High Tolerance give you more haste, which is nice. Also, the Ox build is looking a little bit better in Raid when you're taking more damage as well, because it kind of scales with your stagger. But all around, it's a well-rounded tank. It also has some party utility that I actually forgot to talk about there. Close to the heart, increased healing by 8%. If you're going to take that talent to anyone within 10 yards, as well as the extra avoidance that you can get from Generous Pour. Now, these aren't really going to be up on your whole raid the entire fight because tanks do tend to be a little bit isolated. But in situations where the group kind of needs to stack up for your healer, when you're taking big pulsing damage or a mechanic goes out, everyone kind of needs to stack to help the heals. Having a Brewmaster Monk with these abilities, or really any monk with these class abilities, is really going to be helpful. And not to mention, we didn't really talk about it, but Mystic Touch, it bringing that raid buff, of course. Like we talked about with most of the tanks, if you do not have another monk in your raid, Mystic Touch is a must.
Yep. All right, our next leather tank, going to talk about Druid. And Druid brings Mark of the Wild, and in Mythic Plus, we had it up in the S tier. Here we're going to have it down near the bottom of A tier, because there are a few things that Druid doesn't handle as well in Raid as they do in Mythic Plus. First of all, your rage generation is going to be lower, so whereas in Mythic Plus, keeping up 3, maybe even 4 stacks of Iron Fur the entire time is pretty doable, which increases your armor a ton to even higher, the highest armor of any of the tanks. In single target, your rage generation is going to be a little bit lower. That means that you're not going to have as many stacks of Iron Fur. It means you're not going to reduce the cooldown of Incarn as much. There are a few things that Guardian has going for it. It's going to be doing very good single target damage. Some of the bug fixes that came in are going to help make Druid a little bit more tankier, as well as give it higher single target damage during Incarn due to being able to work in more mauls. And Tooth and Claw buffing Maw is going to be a very helpful thing for Druid and Raid. They do have a couple issues though, in that they their mobility isn't too great. They bring Stampeding Roar, which helps, but that can be brought by any druid. And outside of that, they don't have any the kind of massive leaps and stuff of, your demon hunters, your warriors, your monks, things like that. So their mobility is a little bit lower than some of those other classes. Overall, we think that Guardian Druid is going to be just fine. You'll see people running this in Mythic Raid, and they won't have any issues, especially helpful with its higher damage. We just don't think that it's going to be necessarily quite as strong as some of the other tanks. We have it down at the bottom of A, just because it doesn't bring quite as much utility.
Yep. All right, let's move on to Vengeance Demon Hunter. This one's going to be at the top of A. It's arguable that this could be considered the best raid tank. We were actually going back and forth between that and another tank. It's kind of like, what is the best? And it's almost like you could kind of, depending on what you're doing, they have a lot of similar skills. It's extremely mobile, extremely tanky. Demon Spikes is great. It does, it's very, very simple to play too. I don't know if necessarily that means to be part of, hey, this is a stronger tier tank because it's easier to play, but it is very strong and very simple, which helps for newer players as well, picking the spec up. Like I said, your main defensive is Demon Spikes, which doesn't cost any resources, super easy to maintain. It does great single target damage, which really helps in the raid. Soul Cleave is extremely strong, as well as applies two stacks of frailty to your primary target, which is going to be more useful in raid than in Mythic Plus as well. You can even opt out of Spirit Bomb, like on fights like Taros that are 100% single target, and use a point elsewhere. You do have the option for picking up chains on fights like Dathia, which is nice for a little bit of extra mob control. Also, Sigil of Silence is going to be huge on that fight, as it has like a stack of just 6 adds that it'll cast. And using chains and or Sigil of Silence to stack them up is going to be really helpful. As far as raid buffs it brings, Chaos Brand is pretty much a must. Although with Havoc looking really, really, really strong right now, I don't necessarily think that takes away from Vengeance. But if you look at maybe like the World First race, they may actually opt out of using a Vengeance Demon Hunter and probably plug in a tank like a Warrior or something, where you're going to get a different raid buff out of that, because they might get their Chaos Brand from the Havoc Demon Hunter and not feel like you need to bring Vengeance. It has some pretty awesome flexibility in its talent tree. You're pretty much going to have to take Frailty. That's where you're going to get most of your tankiness as well as extra damage. But as far as deciding between to go down the middle of the tree and picking up like Feed the Demon and your Last Resort Cheat Death, while those are great, you can actually opt into like a Fiery Brand build, which is really strong in single target, going to be really strong in raid. I mean, it's a 40% DR that you get down on, a 45 second cooldown with 2 charges. And it also increases the damage that you do to that target by 20%, your fire damage to them by 20%. I mean, these are talents that are just really, really strong in raid. Great mob control, great mobility, looking really good on just all of the fights. It kind of has a button for everything, or at least not necessarily a button for everything, but it has the kit to really handle every single raid encounter. It's looking very strong. I think it's the number one tank, in my personal opinion.
All right, so then getting into the plate tanks, I'll start with Blood DK. Blood DK is gonna land in B for us. It does bring anti-magic zone, which is incredibly useful in certain situations. So there are going to be a few places throughout the fight where having AMZ available is going to be really nice. Specifically thinking of things like Dathia. There's a couple uses there for it. Blood DK, again, even here, is going to be one of the most self-sufficient tanks, but that's less important in raid when you have more healers available to help spot you up than it is in Mythic Plus when you've only got one healer. They still have good mob control. Grips are always going to be useful situationally. So again, fight like Dathia, where there's adds to group up, it'll be useful. But there's other classes that can do that too. Things like Typhoon or Ring of Peace are going to be just fine there. And also DPS DK can also bring those grips. Blood DK is probably going to struggle a little bit on Broodkeeper Diurna. There's a pretty big mortal strike that you have to be able to take, and it's without being able to heal significantly for about 8 seconds. That's going to really gimp Blood DK there. Also on Razagath, which again we haven't tested, there's a mechanic that the raid damage is going to be dependent on how much damage you mitigate, which for Blood is almost 0. So blood's probably going to take a little bit bigger hit there, need more externals and things like that in order to keep the party and raid damage down a little bit. Overall, you're going to be fine if you run a Blood DK. You're not going to be horribly gimping your raid in general, but it has lower mobility, has a little bit lower damage, and there's just not really anything that's going to push it up to make it better than the other tanks. So we think overall we're going to land with it in B tier.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's a fight this tier either where it's like you have to have Gorfien's Grasp where you have to have this grip to just make the fight so much easier. That doesn't really exist in this raid, and I think that kind of drops Blood DK stock just a little bit because that's kind of its raid buff that it brings, right? It doesn't have a raid buff other than just sort of that utility.
Right. So, all right, getting on to Prop Paladin.
Yeah, Prop Paladin. We got this one down in B tier as well. Probably ahead of Blood DK, but I think it's kind of lacking in similar ways. It doesn't have great mobility. Kind of got your horse, which you can run 2 charges with, probably will. Does have your bop and your sack, which are extremely useful in raids. There are some mechanics where immunities are going to be good, as well as Blessing of Spell Warding, which is unique to Prot as well. So in that way, it kind of makes it unique, and I think puts that ahead of Blood DK there. As damage-wise, it's kind of on the lower end. Self-healing-wise, it's kind of on the lower end as well compared to the other tanks. It is super tanky during Sentinel, but I almost wonder if you'll forgo that and pick up Avenging Wrath. Not pick up Avenging Wrath, but actually go for the 20% crit as opposed to the defensive options there, just because you might not necessarily need that extra tankiness, and it really helps out to be able to put out a little bit extra damage. That being said, it's still not top tier damage compared to the tanks above it, and so you kind of end up in this spot where the utility that it does have, some of it's really, really strong, like I said, Spell Warding and Bop, but then things like Divine Toll, not quite as impactful in raid, as there's not usually like a ton of interrupts that you're going to have to get. And kind of the mob control that it does bring kind of around that point, it's just really not as strong. As far as raid buffs, it brings Devo Aura, which again, if Ret and Holy Paladins are not being brought, then this is a must and bumps it up in tier level for sure. But it just feels like a really underwhelming spec to me in a lot of ways. And when you stack them up compared to the other ones, it's not that it's a bad tank. It just feels really mediocre.
Right, and it's not better than any of the other tanks, really, besides Blood.
No, not really.
All right, so that leaves us with Prot Warrior, and we're actually just going to land Prot Warrior in A as well. And our thinking on this is that there's not really any tank that just stands out as, like, this is the tank that you have to bring to raid because it's the best one. Like, all 4 of these tanks, all 6 of these tanks really are good options, but none of them are really standing out. So Warrior could kind of probably be changed in or freely with Vengeance here. It's kind of that top of A.
This was the discussion we had before where we're trying to place these two, where I kind of side more on Vengeance and Kazi's siding more on Prot Warrior here.
Overall, Prot Warrior is going to mitigate more damage. They have, with their shield block and ignore pain, and then all their other tools that they have, the ability to bring spell block on certain fights if they need it. Those are going to be things that are just really helpful for giving Prot Warrior a boost in general. They also have extremely high mobility. They bring Rallying Cry. They bring Battle Shout if you need it. So they have a whole lot of tools. They have an AoE silence for something like Dathea where you want to group stuff up. So there isn't really anything the Warrior can't do that you expect a tank to be able to do. Having said that, they're still a little bit behind on some of the damage. Again, not so far behind that it's going to feel like you're impeding your raid to bring one, but it is going to be slightly lower damage than some of the highest damage tanks. But overall, especially as you get onto fights like Diurna and Razagath, where with how we think that fight is going to work, having the tank that can just mitigate a lot of damage is really, really going to be helpful. So we think Warrior's going to land right up there at the top of A, kind of fighting with Vengeance for that top spot for best tank.
I do still think you're going to see a lot of Warriors too for Race to World first stuff. I mean, it is going to be. I think those two tanks especially are going to be like the two probably that are most represented. I didn't even talk about darkness too, by the way, for Vengeance, and the fact that it does bring darkness. Reminded me of that when you talked about Rallying Cry for having a raid defensive. It's another reason why Vengeance is up there as well, is the ability to talent into it or out of it if you don't need it, as well as a lot of the utility in their kit. You can sort of opt in or out of that, and it's just a really good design, well-designed tank right now. It's really fun to play too.
Yeah, same with Warrior. So, all right, well, that's going to do it for this one. Again, we appreciate it, and if you're able to help us out with that subscribe button, that goes a long way. We appreciate it.
Yep.
And we'll see you guys in the next one.
Buff Word to Glory. We're out.